The February blizzard that buried the Cariboo Plateau under 1/2 meter of snow in 6 hours was the kind of storm that reminded people why the high country of British Columbia was not meant for the faint-hearted. But on that particular Tuesday night, the 3rd week of February, what drove Thea Gallagher's blood cold had nothing to do with the temperature dropping to -28 outside her cabin walls. It was the dog. For 7 months, Bear had not reacted to anything. Thea had adopted him through the Canadian Armed Forces Retired Working Dog Resettlement Program, a quiet bureaucratic process that moved with the careful deliberateness of people who understood the weight of what they were placing in civilian hands. Bear was a 7-year-old black Labrador retriever, 82 pounds of muscle that moved like something poured rather than built. He had served with JTF2, Joint Task Force 2, Canada's most specialized counter-terrorism unit, as a search and rescue dog attached to an operational support element working out of Trenton, Ontario. His handler's name was in the paperwork, listed under deceased, confirmed. The sergeant who processed her application at CFB Edmonton, a compact, precise woman named Warrant Officer Wagged, had taken Thea into a separate room before introducing her to Bear. She had set a manila folder on the table between them and pressed her palm flat on its cover before sliding it across. "Before I show you this dog," Warrant Officer Wagged said, "I need you to understand what happened to him." 14 months before Thea drove to Edmonton, Bear's unit had been tasked with supporting a mountain rescue operation in the Yukon, near the Kaskawulsh Glacier. A group of backcountry skiers had gone missing in conditions that deteriorated fast. Bear and his handler, JTF2 Sergeant Eli Strath, had been inserted by helicopter at dawn to work the search grid. The avalanche hit at 14:23 local time. The rescue team that reached the site 4 hours later found 2 bodies, 3 injured survivors, and a black Labrador sitting in the snow with his head pressed against his handler's buried form, as if listening for a heartbeat that was no longer there. Sergeant Strath's body was recovered 2 days later. The official report listed cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with avalanche burial. Bear had been airlifted out in a state of catatonic stillness that had not improved in the 13 months since. "He won't track," Warrant Officer Wagged said. "He won't search. He sits and he watches. He's been medically cleared. There's nothing physically wrong. His drive is just gone." She paused. "His threat assessment is still very much present. He's not a danger, but he's not a house pet either. He's somewhere in between, and we need to find him somewhere quiet before that in-between becomes something worse." Thea had understood that better than Warrant Officer Wagged probably expected. She had spent 4 years as a primary care paramedic in Vancouver, and then 18 months on a rapid response team covering the downtown east side. She had held people together on sidewalks while traffic moved around them. She had performed CPR on a 15-year-old boy in a bus shelter on a Tuesday morning in October, and felt the exact moment the life stopped fighting back, and she had gone home, changed her uniform, and gone back to finish her rotation, because there were 3 more shifts left on the clock. She had burned out the way glaciers calve, gradually and then all at once. The leave she took was supposed to be 6 weeks. She bought a decommissioned agricultural property near Horsefly Lake in the Cariboo instead, 91 acres of second-growth forest and wild meadow, a cedar log cabin that had been empty long enough for the mice to get territorial, and no neighbors for 11 kilometers in any direction. The nearest RCMP detachment was in Williams Lake, 40 minutes on dry roads. She took Bear home the same week she hung a new deadbolt on the cabin door. The first months with him were strange in the way that 2 broken things existing in the same space can be strange. Not peaceful exactly, but honest. Bear didn't play. He didn't beg for food or paw at her leg when she sat reading. He ate what she put down, slept by the front door, and spent his waking hours conducting a slow, silent survey of every window in the cabin, working his way around the perimeter in a rotation that never varied. He did not wag his tail, not once. Dr. Sandra Thorpe, the veterinarian out of Horsefly, who agreed to make house calls after Thea explained the situation, had been measured in her assessment. "He's not depressed in the way we usually see in dogs," Dr. Thorpe said, snapping her bag closed while keeping her eyes on Bear, who was sitting in the corner of the living room studying her with the focused attention of someone reviewing a security risk. "He's vigilant. There's a difference. A depressed dog loses interest in the world." This one is still reading it, very carefully. Whatever he's looking for, he hasn't stopped looking. By the 5th month, a tentative geography of trust had formed between them. Bear began following Thea on her morning rounds of the property. Not beside her, but 12 paces back, and slightly to the left, always keeping her and the tree line in the same field of view. He started accepting his food directly from her hand rather than from the bowl. He let her sit on the porch with him in the evenings, without moving away. He never barked, he never growled, he never showed teeth. But he watched, and somewhere in the watching, Thea stopped feeling quite so alone in 11 kilometers of wilderness. She thought, some mornings, that they were healing each other. She thought the thing following him from the Kaskawulsh had finally begun to loosen its grip. She had no idea that Bear wasn't healing. He was waiting. The hydro lines went down at 21:47 on the Tuesday. Thea wasn't alarmed. The cabin ran on a diesel generator and a wood stove, and she had 2 cords of split birch stacked on the north wall of the porch that would outlast any storm the Cariboo could manufacture. She lit 3 oil lanterns, added a log to the stove, poured herself a mug of tea, and sat down in the worn armchair beside the bookcase, with the novel she had been working through for 3 weeks. Bear was in his place by the door, chin on paws, ears rotating slowly in the way they always did, not listening to anything specific, Thea had decided long ago, just maintaining general awareness the way a smoke detector maintains awareness, baseline noise. At 23:18, something changed. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was a single sound from somewhere deep in Bear's chest. Not a growl, not a whine, something older than both. A frequency. Thea looked up from her book. Bear was standing. The hackles along his spine had risen from the base of his neck all the way to his tail, a stiff ridge that caught the lamplight. His head was turned not toward the door, but toward the south-facing window, the one that looked down the long gravel lane toward the road. Bear that kept her voice level, easy. He didn't look at her. He stepped forward until his nose was centimeters from the glass. His breath fogged a small oval against the dark pane. Then he began to pace. It wasn't the anxious spinning of a frightened dog. It was tight, deliberate, and absolutely silent. 4 steps toward the window, 4 steps back, body angled to keep the glass in constant view. Thea had watched him ignore coyotes for 7 months. She had watched him register and dismiss a pair of black bears that came within 40 meters of the fence line in September. Without his hackles so much as twitching, she knew what casual attention looked like in this dog. This was not casual attention. Her .30-06 hunting rifle was in the gun safe in the hallway closet. Thea crossed the room quietly, punched in the combination. The electronic beep was the loudest sound in the house, and pulled the rifle out. She worked the bolt and chambered around. Bear didn't flinch at the sound. He kept pacing. Thea killed 2 of the 3 lanterns. In the near dark, she could see better through glass. She moved to the south window, standing back far enough that she wouldn't be silhouetted, and looked out into the blizzard. The motion-activated floodlight above the equipment shed was swinging and flickering in the gusts, throwing the yard in and out of visibility. Snow came down horizontal in the wind, the lane beyond the gate a smear of white and darkness. There was no reason for anything human to be on that lane. Her driveway gate was padlocked. The nearest road was 11 kilometers away, and conditions an hour ago had been severe enough that the Williams Lake RCMP had issued a travel advisory on the radio. The floodlight steadied for 2 seconds. There was a figure on the lane. Thea's hand tightened on the rifle stock. She made herself breathe through her nose, slow and deliberate, the same breath she used when arriving on scene to something bad. The figure was moving toward the cabin at a pace that was not hurried. In the intermittent light, she could see dark clothing, layered and heavy, completely rimed with ice, broad shoulders, height that read well over 6 feet, even through the distortion of blowing snow. The gait was wrong for a lost hiker. It was too controlled, too even. The kind of movement that belonged to someone who had been walking through very bad conditions for a very long time and had made a private decision to stop feeling them. The figure reached the gate. There was a pause. Then, without difficulty, the padlocked gate swung open. He had picked the lock in -28, in a blizzard, in gloves. Thea stepped back from the window. "Williams Lake RCMP, 40 minutes away," she said aloud, the arithmetic of her isolation landing with new weight. She moved to the hallway doorway and set her back against the wall, rifle raised to low ready. Bear had stopped pacing. He was standing dead center in front of the door, and the change in him was absolute and alarming. The pacing was gone. The hackles were still up. His muscles had drawn so tight that his hind legs were trembling, not with fear, but with the effort of restraining enormous, concentrated energy. In 7 months, Thea had never seen him look like this. She'd read in the intake paperwork, in the careful language of military assessment, that Bear's bite work capability remained fully intact, despite his psychological withdrawal. She understood now, for the first time, exactly what that meant. The man's boots hit the porch steps. 1, 2, 3 heavy thuds of frozen rubber on cedar planks. He reached the door. He didn't knock immediately. There was a long pause, 5 seconds, 10, in which the only sounds were the wind and the stove and Thea's own heartbeat. Then a gloved hand grasped the door handle. He tried it, locked. "I am armed, and I have called the RCMP," Thea said, projecting her voice through the door with the clarity she had developed years ago over the noise of traffic and sirens. "Step back from the door. Step back now." The figure on the other side went still. He didn't retreat. He didn't speak. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then a voice came through the door, low and cracked and barely above a murmur, a voice that had been used sparingly for a long time. 2 syllables. "Bear." The sound that came from Bear's throat was unlike anything Thea had heard from him in 7 months. It wasn't a bark. It was a cry, high and broken and desperately urgent, the sound of something held shut for a very long time suddenly flying open. The black Labrador threw himself against the door with his full 82 pounds, scratching at the wood with both front paws, making sounds that rose up into the cedar rafters of the cabin and stayed there. Thea's finger hovered near the trigger guard. Her mind ran the math fast and clinical, the way she had been trained to assess a scene before stepping into it. Bear had not reacted to a single person in 7 months, not the vet, not the delivery driver who had come in August, not Thea herself, for weeks. He had been assessed as incapable of bonding with anyone who was not his original handler. His original handler was listed as deceased, confirmed. The voice outside said something else. A single short word, German, she recognized, a command. Bear sat. He sat with the violence of something dropping from a height, his hindquarters hitting the hardwood hard, his eyes fixed on the door handle with an intensity that bordered on anguish. He was whimpering, tiny, rhythmic sounds on every exhale, and his tail, the tail that had never once moved in 7 months, had begun to beat in short, involuntary strokes against the floor. Thea lowered the rifle 6 inches. She crossed to the door. Her hands were not entirely steady as she reached out and turned the deadbolt. She kept the rifle in her right hand as she gripped the handle with her left and pulled the door open. The cold that came in was stunning, wind chill somewhere near -40 on exposed skin. Snow swept into the entryway and scattered across the floor. The man standing on her porch looked like something the glacier had decided to give back. He was tall, though the weight on him had gone wrong. Too lean in the face and shoulders, the kind of lean that came from months of insufficient food rather than training. His beard was thick and ice-crusted, his skin weathered past the ordinary reach of weather, and into something that had seen real deprivation. His eyes were grey, pale enough to catch the lamplight from inside, and they were fixed entirely on the dog. He was holding his right arm pressed against his left side, dark staining soaked through his jacket from mid-ribs to his hip. The cold had slowed the bleeding, but not stopped it. He didn't look at the rifle. He looked at Bear. "Stand down, buddy," he said. His voice broke on the last word. "I'm here, I'm here." Bear did not attack. The dog that had been assessed as a loaded weapon with no safety did not launch. He flowed off his haunches and covered the distance to the man in a single motion, pressing his head against the man's right knee, his whole body shaking, his tail moving for the first time in more than a year, not wagging but hammering, back and forth, striking the door frame on every pass. The man went down to one knee on the icy porch. It wasn't entirely a choice. His left leg folded, and he came down hard, and he wrapped his one good arm around Bear's neck and pressed his forehead against the top of the dog's skull, and the sound he made was not a word in any language. Thea stood in the doorway with her rifle half raised, and a medical mind that had switched on without her permission, cataloguing, blood loss significant, core temperature compromised, time in elements extended, depth of wound unknown. She looked at the man, kneeling on her porch with an arm around a dog that had not let anyone touch him in over a year, and she made her decision. "Get inside," she said, "now." She grabbed him by the collar of his jacket and pulled. He got one leg under himself. She threw his good arm over her shoulder, and they crossed the threshold together. She kicked the door shut with her heel and threw the bolt. She got him into the kitchen chair under the lantern. Bear pressed against his right leg and did not move. Thea pulled her trauma kit from the cabinet above the fridge. She had kept one in every home she had ever lived in. Habit from a decade of being the person people called when things went wrong, and set it on the table. She took up the trauma shears and cut open his jacket without asking permission. Then the fleece beneath it, then the thermal. The wound was a deep laceration running from his lower left ribs along a diagonal. Not a knife wound, she realized, reading the wound margins with fingers that had done this before. A gunshot graze, high velocity from the characteristics. Through and through on the lateral chest wall, the cold had constricted the vessels enough to prevent exsanguination, but his skin temperature told her he had been outside for a very long time. "You're lucky," Thea said, tearing open a package of hemostatic gauze. "The cold kept you alive. If you'd been walking in July, you would have bled out in the first kilometer." She pressed the gauze against the wound with steady, even pressure. "Don't move." He didn't. He was looking at Bear the way she'd had seen people look at things they had stopped believing were real. "They told me you were dead," Thea said, wrapping a pressure bandage around his chest, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had done this in worse conditions with less light. JTF2 confirmed it. "You're listed in Bear's intake paperwork as deceased." The man was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had the careful flatness of someone choosing words the way a person chooses footholds on ice. "They thought I was," he said. "I was buried for over 6 hours, but the snow cavity was deep enough. I had air." A pause. "The people who found me were not a rescue team." Thea secured the bandage and held pressure without speaking. "My name is Eli Strath," he said. "Former sergeant, JTF2, Bear's handler." He reached down with a hand that had been cold so long the skin looked translucent and placed it behind the dog's ear. Bear's eyes closed, The avalanche wasn't weather. Our patrol route that morning had been passed to a criminal network that uses the Kaskawulsh corridor to move synthetic opioids out of the Yukon into BC supply chains. Our unit had identified 2 of their ground teams the week before. They needed us gone. Thea wrapped a thermal blanket around his shoulders without comment, her training running parallel to everything her mind was trying to process. "The men who found you in the snow," she said, "they weren't rescuers. They were the network's extraction team. They'd been staged to recover product from the avalanche debris, and they found me instead, alive with a complete intelligence picture of their operation and nowhere to go." Eli's jaw tightened. "They kept me in a facility in the territory for 14 months. Legitimate on paper. Supply flights, seasonal rotation, nobody asking questions." 14 months, Thea said quietly. "I broke containment 3 weeks ago during a structural failure in a secondary building during a storm. I contacted a trusted warrant officer at Kansovkov through a dead drop I'd staged before deployment. She's been building a Crown prosecution file, but she needs me alive and in front of a federal tribunal to make the indictments stick." He exhaled carefully around the bandage. "I needed somewhere to go to ground that wasn't in any of their intelligence. When I accessed Bear's resettlement file through a contact at base, I saw he'd been placed with a civilian in the Cariboo. I knew I could walk the ground." He met her eyes for the first time since she'd sat down across from him. His were grey and steady and exhausted in the way of something emptied out and still running on structure alone. "I led them to you. I didn't have anywhere else. I'm sorry for that." As though the sentence had been a cue, Bear's head came up. Not slowly, all at once, ears flat, lips drawing back from his teeth in a silent and absolute alarm. He wasn't facing the front door. He was facing the back wall, toward the mudroom and the door that opened out toward the equipment shed. Eli came out of the chair before Thea had fully processed what she was seeing. He did it with the economy of a body that remembered how to be operational, even when it was running on fumes, absorbing the pain of standing with a single controlled breath through his nose. How many entries? The weariness had gone from his voice, replaced by something precise and cold. Front door, mudroom at the back, and the east bedroom window. Thea was already moving. She reached above the fridge and came down with the Mossberg 500 she had kept since buying the property, loaded with buckshot, and passed it to Eli. He took it with his good hand and checked the chamber by touch alone, not looking away from the back wall. "Kill the last lantern." She did. The cabin went dark. The wood stove threw a dim reddish pulse from its air vents, not enough to silhouette them, but enough to navigate by. Outside, the storm screamed against the eaves. "Fuss," Eli said, barely above a whisper. Bear pressed his shoulder against Eli's left leg and went completely still. Together the 3 of them moved behind the chimney stack of the wood stove, the one piece of masonry in the cabin heavy enough to stop a rifle round. Thea held her .30-06 low, safety off. Through the mudroom door, a lockpick worked for 4 seconds and then stopped. Then the door came in. It didn't open. It gave, the frame splintering inward as a boot connected just above the handle. Cold air flooded through from the back of the cabin. A figure in white and grey snow camo swept inside, a suppressed rifle coming up. "Fass." Bear left Eli's side like a stone released from a sling. 82 pounds of black Labrador hit the man at sternum height before he could acquire a target in the dark. The sheer impact drove him backward into the doorframe. The suppressed rifle discharged into the ceiling. Bear's jaws locked on the man's forearm, and they went down hard into the mudroom, the weapon clattering away across the floor. 2 things happened in the same instant. Eli moved for the back of the cabin to control the threat, and the east bedroom window came apart. The 3rd attacker came through low and fast, glass grinding under heavy boots. He had a pistol with a laser sight, and the red dot swept across the near wall, tracked along the chimney, and began searching the dark room. Thea was no longer where she had been. She had moved left on instinct the moment she heard the window, 3 steps and into the corner behind the bookcase, the rifle already at her cheek. The laser found the chimney, swung toward her position, found her. She fired. The 30-06 in an enclosed space was enormous. The muzzle flash lit the room white. The round caught the shooter in his left shoulder, spinning him sideways, and he hit the bedroom door frame and went to one knee, his pistol arm dropping. From the back of the cabin, the Mossberg fired once. Then silence. Thea stayed in her corner, rifle up, her own heartbeat filling her ears. She could hear Bear in the mudroom, not barking, making no sound at all, just the controlled breathing of a dog performing the task he had been built for. Clear Eli's voice came from the back hallway, back entry clear. East room, Thea called, 1 down and disarmed, still breathing. She moved to the man she had shot, keeping the rifle on him while she pulled his secondary weapon from his belt and threw it across the room. His shoulder was wrecked, but nothing arterial was severed. She would examine the irony of that later, that her hands moved automatically to assess the injury in the man who had just tried to kill her. Some habits ran deeper than the situation. Eli came through from the mudroom. He was breathing hard, and his left side had started seeping through the pressure bandage again. Bear was at his heel, his gait unhurried and precise, every inch of him back in the work he had been trained for. Third, Eli asked. Shoulder, out of the fight. Thea looked at him across the dark room. You're bleeding again. I'm aware. Then, sit down. He sat. Bear pressed against his knee immediately, heavy and warm, and Eli put his hand on the dog's back without looking, the gesture as automatic and necessary as breathing. It was 11 minutes before the sound came through the storm. Thea heard it before she could name it. A deep, rhythmic pulse beneath the wind, growing. Then she knew. Rotors. Heavy ones coming in fast from the south. The yard outside blazed to life, not from the motion sensor, but from something airborne, sweeping the snow-covered ground in flat white light. A voice through a loud hailer, fighting the wind. RCMP Emergency Response Team. All persons inside the structure. Place your weapons on the floor and move to the front entrance with your hands visible. Eli set the Mossberg down on the floor with extreme care. He let out a long, controlled breath, and something left the set of his shoulders. Not collapse, but release, the way a drawn bowstring releases after the arrow has already gone. My warrant officer came through, he said. Within minutes, the yard filled with ERT officers in tactical gear, moving with the efficient quiet of people who did this regularly. The 2 surviving attackers were loaded into an armored vehicle that appeared at the end of the lane, like a hallucination out of the blowing snow. A paramedic, young, focused, came through the door and immediately took over Eli's wound management, glancing over Thea's pressure bandage work with raised eyebrows before nodding once in professional recognition. Thea sat on the hearth with a blanket around her shoulders and watched. Bear had not left Eli's side. He sat pressed against the stretcher the paramedics had produced, his head resting on Eli's right thigh, his eyes tracking every person who moved through the cabin with the steady assessment of a dog back in his element. When an ERT officer approached too quickly, Bear's head lifted, and the officer stepped back, reading the message without difficulty. Then Eli's hand moved down and found the space behind Bear's left ear where the fur was thickest. He scratched, slow and deliberate. Bear's tail moved. Not the frantic, involuntary hammering Thea had seen at the door. This was different. One long, unhurried sweep to the right, then back. Then another, the tail of a dog who had remembered in some place below language what it felt like to have the world make sense again. The ERT commander told Thea they were taking Eli to the University Hospital of Northern BC in Prince George for treatment and debrief. It would take weeks to process the intelligence on the network, Weeks to move through the official channels required to formally clear Sergeant Strath's name and reinstate his service record. The Crown prosecution was expected to proceed against the network principals within the month. Eli's testimony would be the keystone. Eli was sitting up on the stretcher, an IV line running into his right arm, when Thea came to stand in the doorway of the cabin. The east bedroom window was stuffed with a sleeping bag to hold out the cold. The mudroom frame would need replacing before she could use the back door again. The list of repairs was already forming in the part of her mind that defaulted to the practical when everything else was still catching up. "Bear," she said, "when you're cleared, he should come back to you." Eli looked at the dog and then at her. "They'll discharge me from active service," he said, without bitterness, "the way you state a fact about the weather. There's no going back to the unit after this. I don't have anywhere to go after Prince George." Thea looked out at the yard, the churned snow, the broken mudroom door, the glass from the east window that still needed to be swept up, the generator humming steadily in the equipment shed, as though nothing at all had happened tonight. "The mudroom door needs replacing," she said, "and I've been trying to get the back fence line repaired since September. This property is too much for one person." Eli looked at her for a moment in the way people look when they have been alone, long enough that ordinary sentences take a beat to arrive at their full meaning. Then he looked down at Bear. Bear's tail moved twice against the stretcher frame, slow and certain, like a clock that has finally been wound. "We'll be back," Eli said. And when the ERT transport pulled away from the lane in the grey hour before dawn, the storm finally exhausted, the Cariboo sky beginning its slow, reluctant decision to clear, Thea stood at the repaired front door with a mug of tea going cold in her hands, and she found that 11 kilometers of wilderness felt, for the first time since she had arrived here, like exactly the right amount of space. Not too much, not too little. Just enough room for what was about to grow there.